Ya vamos acercándonos al final de este seminario inaugural del 6º Cybersecurity Summer Bootcamp. Y para poner un broche final contamos con Gazlay, es jefe de área de divulgación de vulnerabilidades de Cisa, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, que nos va a desvelar cómo se produjo y qué experiencias, ¿no?, hemos sacado y hemos extraído de aquel ataque a la cadena de suministro que vivió Solarwinds. Bueno, a través de ese, si recuerdan, a través de ese malware insertado en actualizaciones de software. Hello, Jay. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Welcome. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much.
Well, go ahead and tell us, please, what happened at Solarwinds.
Well, thank you so much for asking. I believe we have some slides that we can show that walk through some of the items here that may help, but I'm going to be happy to go through those. I'll start with some of the key takeaways that we've learned as part of our SolarWinds and other adversarial response. Specifically with regard to this campaign, we are dealing with a patient and resourceful adversary. They understand where we are weak. And I want to be clear about where we all are weak together. First, our architectures are overtly trusting. Second, at least in the US federal government and broadly across the community, we are seeing that cloud identity is not where it needs to be yet, and there will be a number of years before we get there. Finally, the amount of coordination isn't there. Second, our adversaries understand how our work posture has changed and how to best exploit it. 15 years ago, and in many ways until a year ago, most of our connections were from a workstation inside the network to a resource inside the same network. Boy, things have changed with COVID, with millions and millions of people now working from home. This adversary has exploited that change in work posture in a way that really cuts to the core of how we secure systems. Next, the recon for this effort would have started in 2019, if not earlier. In the first known foothold, back a slide, was earlier, and so if we think that the first known SolarWinds networks compromise was in September 2019, when did they start looking at this? Second, the adversaries exploited weaknesses in both our supply chain and our identity management. This campaign had SolarWinds involvement, but really non-supply chain methods were used, including password spraying, for example, which could be really easily stopped with multi-factor authentication. Second note, SolarWinds was not installed at over 30% of the impacted entities from this campaign, so the campaign was broader. And in many instances, we're still not sure what that initial intrusion vector was. Last note on this page is that the adversary actions towards their ultimate goals are very difficult for many organizations to identify, and that's because the adversary used they used known good logins to shield their traffic and to remain stealthy. And so we need to, as a community, have better cloud telemetry, understand that even though a login may be successful, it may not be appropriate, and that we need to deploy behavior analytics widely across our infrastructure. Final little note on this page is, when you're doing incident response and the adversary is looking at your every move, that complicates your program and complicates the work you must do as an incident responder. So making sure that you have out-of-bands communications, such as simple as Signal or as Post-it notes, are really helpful. Now, I'd like to go to the next slide and walk you through some of the timeline here. And I really think it's important for everybody to understand just how long this went. So at no time was this adversary detected on SolarWinds network. It wasn't until the FireEye report at the very end that somebody noticed. So let's just quickly walk through what happened here and when. So we saw back in September 2019, the threat actor initially accessed the SolarWinds network and injected code into the build process for the SolarWinds product. They then waited patiently until they could see it deployed out into target networks. So we assume that that happened after the 11/4/2019 date. Back in, then you go forward till February 2020, and that's when the Sunburst code was compiled and then deployed into SolarWinds product. The hotfix was then made available to customers 5 weeks later. And then in that period of time that lasts from the end of June to the end of March to the beginning of June, we saw thousands and thousands of targets that were impacted by this code, this malicious code. Now, if you see, there was no detection from anybody who had this activity until SolarWinds was notified of Sunburst by FireEye as part of their compromise. I'd like to highlight to everybody here how that happened. A help desk technician at FireEye saw an error where a user was trying to add a new form of multi-factor authentication. So just the most basic of problems, which is an MFA ad, was noticed by a help desk tech and flagged for his management. Now, we as an industry spend billions of dollars a year on complex and useful, powerful tools. But sometimes it's important to remember having a well-trained help desk, incident response procedure, and multi-factor authentication can really make your life a lot better. The rest of this activity happened in the news, where we had daily updates from my team at Cisa, from the team over at SolarWinds, and a variety of both public and private sector partners. This continued, the investigation, it says ongoing. It is ongoing. We will probably be years before we have full ground truth as to everything that happened as part of this campaign. Suffice to say, though, we've definitely learned some lessons. We have the next slide, please. So first, identity is everything. With cloud and hosted infrastructure and remote work driving this forward, identity is our new perimeter. And while the term is a little loud, it's almost ready to say the firewall is dead. COVID has accelerated this trend immensely. And as we talk to people who provide IT services, both within the government and the United States critical infrastructure, we're asking them if they're ready for this. Trust store and identity management compromises are excellent targets for adversaries, and they are exploiting them. The basics of cyber hygiene are a must. You must deploy your tools according to best practices, such as Active Directory. You must implement the privilege of least principal across all of your user account, and you must patch quickly. Those are the basics. Those are always have been, will continue to be. Those help protect you against ransomware. Those help protect you against nation states. But as we move forward, if you want to protect your infrastructure from more sophisticated threats, it's essential that you run tools such as Bloodhound and you understand how the identity infrastructure is set up and that you threat model through it. threat actors are going to model your trust relationships. They're going to get on your wire, and they are going to map out how your infrastructure is configured. You need to do the same. There are some other things that can help you on that front, and that's making sure that you have additional authentication methods to both user and service accounts to make sure that logins remain valid. I would say multi-factor authentication needs to be enabled on every account. We frequently get questions here at Cisa, what do you mean by every account? And we mean every single account, user and service account. We need to make sure that we understand that those are true authentication attempts, and that we have that extra security that's provided by that multi-factor. Finally, and we saw this as part specifically the Solarwinds compromise, for entities that are merging together or considering adding a new business unit, adding a whole domain third-party trust for transparent pass-through authentication is not an okay practice anymore. That's an extremely risky behavior. It's a little in the weeds, but I wanted to make sure that everybody here who has an identity expert understands that as you merge two organizations together, how you handle that identity work is key. Final note here is about behavior analysis techniques. They are required now to identify an identity compromise. It requires both business intelligence and analytics that a lot of businesses don't have. Detecting it can be challenging, but we need to understand why different accounts are acting in certain ways on large networks. And just another, on the next page, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in terms of detection opportunities. Can we go there, please? Great. I want to first be clear on this first bullet point. Detecting a supply chain compromise of this nature is beyond most organizations' capabilities. Threat actors are extremely sophisticated and smart, and they look across the constellation of products and attack us in ways that we are least capable of responding. So what do we have to do to make sure that a supply chain compromise is of least impact to us, or we understand when an adversary gets on the wire? First, let's talk about network baselining and abnormal behavior analytics. One of the things that you should, or that I should see, I live in Washington, D.C., and my organization should see that I am logged in from Washington, D.C. However, if I were to be logging in at the same time from Madrid, that should flag an alert in terms of user behavior that is abnormal, and it should be looked at. We need to do that across all of our users and all of our accounts. Understanding when user behavior is abnormal is one of the only ways to understand when improper activity is occurring in cloud-hosted infrastructures. So that was the first example of an impossible login. How can I concurrently be in both Madrid and Washington, D.C. at the same time? There are some other ones in terms of impossible logins. It's length of time. Why would I be asking for a SAML ticket that goes for 2 days instead of an hour? All of these types of information are included in our activity alert, which I've highlighted below. Detecting post-compromise activity in Microsoft Cloud. The other item here is I want to share with you is Cisa is very proud of the fact that we created some tooling to help network defenders hunt their cloud infrastructures. It's called the Sparrow tool, and it's included on that GitHub page. So next slide, because we're moving forward in time. These are some key questions that both business owners, so the people who own the business side of an infrastructure, and the IT staff need to work together on. These are questions that if you're a head chief risk officer or a chief operating officer, these are types of questions that should be asked of your network staff. Do you know who you trust? Seems pretty simple, but when we talk to both federal agencies and we've talked to many large businesses, understanding who they have configured trust relationships with and how they've done that has often been a bit of a mystery, because the person who does that work is a network admin, but the person who's accepting that risk is the senior level of that firm, company, or organization. When did you last validate that trust? It's a little tricky to validate it, but that is something you should do. Do you have visibility into your hosted cloud environments? Can you see all authentication attempts? Rather amazingly, we found that many companies and critical infrastructure partners just connected to the cloud, but never configured logging in a way that was going to be useful to understand what was actually happening in their infrastructure. Can you see all authentication attempts is something you normally can do in your on-prem environment. It isn't the case in many cloud environments, and it adds a different set of complexity. The last two items I want to highlight quickly. First, if your main network was compromised, can you still operate? That's really hard to do. We've seen entities try and do it. They end up on Signal and in using typewriters and in setting up Google Gmail accounts, that trying to cobble together an infrastructure in the middle of a cyber incident is really challenging. I encourage everybody to do a little planning on that ahead of time. And then finally, when did you last exercise your DR plan? This is actually a really helpful activity to engage in, doing that disaster recovery plan, because it has so many other benefits, not only when dealing with significant nation state threat actors, but also with dealing something as, unfortunately, as common as ransomware. We just responded to a gigantic ransomware incident, and many companies came back to us and said, "Oh, all of our infrastructure was encrypted, but we were fine because we had backups and we just did a restoration." I would encourage everybody here who is responsible for an infrastructure to go out there and do that. Make sure you exercise your backup plan, your disaster recovery plan. With that, I think my slides are over, and I think I'm responsible for answering some questions.
Thank you, Jay. We have two questions from our audience. The first one is, how is the coordination between CISA and FBI and other entities for the management of these incidents? What role does each entity assume?
Great question. There is a lot of coordination between our agency and the FBI and other entities within the US government. We spun up something called a UCG, where we all get together and work on a daily basis. But the governmental roles are, CISA is responsible for the asset response. We, at the US government and within critical infrastructure, are there to help asset owners recover, restore, and protect their infrastructures. FBI is responsible for the threat work, identification of who the bad guys are, and responding to it. That's not my role, but I'm glad we have the FBI there to do that. CISA, the way that we kind of break down those roles and try and explain it to people is CISA considers itself the firefighter, while FBI is the police.
The next question is, you spoke on the importance of the human resource. Do you think that a basic cybersecurity education should be mandatory for new and existing employees in any organization?
It's really hard for me to speak to what the right level of training is for an organization. I grew up in a small town outside of Detroit where many people worked in factories. I would not say to somebody who's working on the assembly line or machinist that maybe cybersecurity is a key part. However, if you have an administrative account on a machine, you should have a deep knowledge of cybersecurity. And that I would say in that case, it's very worthwhile spending quite a bit of time understanding the practice and domains involved.
And finally, how can we deal with organizations, particularly critical infrastructures that accumulate a large technological debt? How can we secure those environments?
Well, technology debt is my favorite topic. I'm glad that somebody is asking me a question about it. Technical debt is the problem of our time. We're going to spend the next 5 to 10 years working with infrastructures to either renew that infrastructure or protect it by network isolation. The thing that we can all do as information technology professionals today is help our boards and help our senior leadership begin to understand the cost of technical debt. And as we bring in new projects, judge the feasibility of projects based on how much technical debt can be brought down. Great question.
Yes, Jay, has been very interesting and useful because it's very important to learn from these cases to be prepared and prevented for the future. Isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for being here today with us. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Bye, Jay. Y muchísimas gracias, bueno, pues por conducirnos también, en este caso, de ataque a la cadena de suministro, en el que los ciberdelincuentes comprometieron numerosas empresas de alto perfil y agencias gubernamentales. Bien, con Jay concluimos esta sesión inaugural del Cybersecurity Summer Bootcamp. Pero arrancamos una serie de 7 jornadas intensas de trabajo y aprendizaje también en torno a los retos y amenazas que afrontamos en las redes. Recuerden que van a ser 6 sesiones de talleres formativos que empiezan mañana mismo en horario de tarde para Europa, concretamente a las 16 horas, peninsular española, y de mañana para América, los días 13, 14, 15, 19, 20 y 21 de julio. Por mi parte, solo despedirme hasta el día 22, en el que estaré de nuevo aquí para conducir el seminario de clausura de este Cybersecurity Summer Bootcamp 2021 y en el que contaremos con un panel de relevantes expertos internacionales, entre muchas otras cosas. Hasta entonces, muchas gracias.